take the 45.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. As usual, I'm too full after Onig. I need to be taking a nap rather than talking about Galatians. But I'll try to stay awake.
Yes, and please
Y'all
don't put
do.
us to
Y'all
sleep.
do.
That's right. She said, don't put us to sleep.
We're on chapter 4. And in this chapter, Shaul continues to present the truth regarding salvation and related issues. His allegory about Israel being under a tutor during that time, the time during which righteousness depended upon sacrifices and the Levitical priesthood, is continued here by him in a slightly different sense. Here he's using the example to begin with of a minor under guardianship. And what would be the opposite of this? It would be the picture of adulthood, which is brought about by the acceptance of Yeshua's covenant, perfect sacrifice through the new covenant. And so here we're going to start on chapter 4. And I say, as long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a bondservant, even though he is legally the owner of the estate. So what is the significance of this statement? There are legal requirements here, and we're really talking about law. Because of legal requirements, the child has no more authority than an indentured servant, than a bondslave. And he is unable as a minor to be able to tend to his own affairs. He cannot make his own decisions. Now, somehow I got that page upside down. So let me get it out and see if we can make things work.
You got to stand on your head to read that one.
But he is under guardians and trustees until the time that his father prearranged. And what this is telling us is that he must obey the orders of the guardian or the trustee until he reaches the age which his father has set for him to be able to inherit. And so in the analogy, the Torah in its sin and sacrifice form through the covenant at Sinai is the guardian that he was talking about here. Even so we, when we were children, we were enslaved under the basic principles of the world. This has always been a little bit of a problem to understand, and I don't know that you will be exactly satisfied with what I'm going to tell you, but we'll give it a try. By saying we, Shaul referred to himself, and I would think that he was referring to the system under which he formerly was as a Pharisaic Jew. The Greek word stoicheion is what is translated as the basic principles of the world. And if you look in the Strong's Index, it can refer to things in a row, such as the letters of the alphabet, and by extension, they say the elements of knowledge or an elementary rule. There is a second interpretation there, as is the heaven, referring to the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars. With regard to that, I would say that we have no knowledge that Israel in any way ever worshiped the sun, moon, and stars, so I don't think that that could be applicable here. But going back, since this is a continuation of Shaul's analogy comparing a child under guardianship with a person of legal age, this would also seem to follow in that same vein. Does that make sense to you? A synthesis of these meanings can allow us to understand stoicheion, it's a hard one to pronounce, to mean having the basic knowledge of a child. And that's the way I'm looking at it. And here it is referring to the traditional Judaism of that day as opposed to that which is available through Yeshua. But when the appointed time, we stop right there for a moment, the appointed time refers to the coming of the Messiah. It was prophesied by Daniel. So know and understand from the issuing of the decree to restore and to build Jerusalem until the time of Mashiach the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So that's the coming of Messiah. Then the verse continues, when the appointed time, the Messiah arrived, when the appointed time arrived, Elohim sent forth Ben Ha Elohim. And that is the Son of God, his only begotten Son, born of an Isha. Yeshua was a man born of an Isha, a human woman. So what the point is being made here is that he was a man. During a time that the commands of the Torah were being overemphasized in a legalistic manner. Now there are several ways you can look at that, but I think that the way he's talking about here is that the Torah was being used in a way not given by Adonai. It had been perverted by certain Pharisees by adding elements not intended by Adonai. And I'm referring specifically here to their requirement for Gentile followers of Yeshua to be circumcised and to convert to Judaism. To redeem them that were under this legalistic interpretation of Torah, that we might receive adoption as sons. I don't know, somehow I got them all up.
Got them all up? We stand on our head. You turn the book over.
I'll just leave it open. I think that's the best thing to do. But what we see here is that not only Gentiles, but also Jews were redeemed by Yeshua and the new covenant. And that after trusting Yeshua, we see that Shaul continued to follow Torah commands, as evidenced by his offering of sacrifices in the temple. This, to me, is proof that it was not the mitzvot, it was not the commands themselves which ended. If they had ended, Shaul would not have done that. So for Yeshua's Talmudim, his disciples, it was atonement through temple sacrifices which ended. That was, as you know, that was a limited atonement. At the Jerusalem Council, we discussed this earlier about oral Torah, which was a part of the traditional Judaism of the day. I'm suggesting that the elders and the disciples at the Jerusalem Council rejected the oral Torah. That the use of certain commands ended when the temple was destroyed, such as the ones regarding sacrifices, was to me, was Adonai's way of rendering those no longer needed as active. Therefore, when the temple was destroyed, those could no longer be done. But all of the rest remained in effect, active and a part of Messianic Jewish and Messianic Gentile life at that time. So what we see is that Yeshua redeemed Israel from the slavery of legalistic perversion of Torah by his sacrificial death, a covenant which was cut, which was put into effect, the new covenant. And through his sacrificial death, Torah commands given at Sinai were written on the hearts of all those who trusted in him. Isaiah 63. But prior to receiving Yeshua, Gentiles were outside the covenants. Ephesians 2:12. You can look that up and check it out. And at the same time, not only were they outside the covenants, they were outside of Israel. So the Galatian acceptance of Yeshua has caused them to become covenant partners and a part of the Commonwealth of Israel. That's all pretty much basic. And because you are now sons, that is, sons and covenant partners by adoption through their redemption by Yeshua, Elohim has sent forth the Ruach, the Spirit of Ben Ha-Elohim, the Son of God, Yeshua, into your hearts. And so what we see here is that the hearts of the Galatians were circumcised by their trusting faith through the gift of Yeshua's sacrifice. Crying out to Adonai for salvation. Abba Avenu, our hearts cry out, dear Father, save us. So you, the Galatians, are no longer a bondservant, that is, a slave to the perversion of the legalistic system, but a ben, a son, and if a ben, an heir of Elohim through Mashiach. So Gentiles, through the promise given to Abraham, were through Messiah, the Anointed One, adopted as sons, becoming inheritors of Adonai's kingdom. But formerly, when you did not know Elohim, you served them. Question is, what is the them that he's talking about? I've inserted here the false gods of mythic Greek and Roman worship.
Mine says weak and worthless principles.
Which by nature are not the true Elohim, not Adonai, not the true God. So I think that's what he's referring to there. But we see something a little different in just a moment. And now, after you have known Elohim, and more importantly, are known by Elohim, how can it be that you are returning to the weak and poor elementary matters of the world? So here we still have a little more discussing and understanding to do. What I just read to you in verse 8 seems to indicate that Shaul was referring to the false gods which the Galatians formerly worshipped. But in this verse, verse 9, which you see there, he also used that Greek word, stoikeion, the same word which he used in verse 3 to refer to the legalistic perversion of Judaism, his own former system, to refer to the weak and poor elementary matters of the world. So he used the same word in both cases. I believe that he was using that same term here as well because he was again referring to the legalistic perversion of Judaism, the system which was seen now to have been in use among the Galatians through the efforts of the Judaizers. That's what he's been talking about from the beginning. Now, Judaizers is not really the best way to refer to that group to which Shaul was referring. Those men were actually Messianic Jews, followers of Yeshua, but they were also Pharisees who believed that those Gentile followers of Yeshua should convert to Judaism. What we know is that Shaul, who was also a Pharisee, he never said he wasn't. He said, I am a Pharisee. He did not believe in their legalistic way of perverting the Torah. And so maybe the best name to use here is perverters, is a better way to refer to those men. Now there is another way of looking at that. Some also understand the weak and poor elementary matters of the world as the Galatians' former worship of false gods through their Greek and Roman cultic system. We have to consider this possibility as well. But since Shaul's primary focus throughout every chapter of this letter so far has been on what the Judaizers were teaching to the Galatians, it seems to me unlikely that the weak and poor elementary matters of this world are to what he was referring, unless it was in a secondary way, that is, the gods, false gods. That they may have been vacillating between the message of the Jewish perverters and their former pagan religion is also a possibility. But again, since Shaul used exactly the same word, stoikeion, in verse 3 and also in verse 9, it seems very likely to me that the legalistic perversion of Torah was that to which he was referring in both these verses. It's possible that at least some of the Galatians had begun to drift away from the correct message of the good news which Shaul had taught them. And it's unfortunate for us that because Shaul knew that the Galatians knew more of the details of what he was writing about, he did not need to fully describe the situation to them. Therefore, it makes it difficult for us to understand. And as Kifah said, Shaul is sometimes hard to understand, and it's probably because many of the important details are left out of the letter, assuming that the readers would know them. And I think that's probably the case here. Because of that, we have to make some assumptions. Do you want to be enslaved by them? That is, do you want to abandon the truth of Yeshua and adoption as sons and return to the slavery of perverted legalism? That enslavement was to a false system and not a reference to the legitimate commands of Torah given by Adonai. And we all know that Shaul could in no way have been referring to Torah, which he described in Romans 7:12 as holy, righteous, and good. Or was Shaul saying, do you want to be enslaved by belief in false gods? So we have to consider both possibilities. And even though his overall message was clearly about the legalistic perversion of Torah, we still have these two things that are possible. And then, again, question mark. You observe special days and months and seasons and years. If you check this out in the Greek, you will see that observe is present tense in this verse. They were doing whatever it was that they were doing at that time that Shaul wrote this letter. You observe special days, months, and seasons. So here again, we must consider that there are two possibilities. Does days, months, seasons, and years refer to Judaism, or does it refer to Greek and Roman cultic worship, or possibly to both? That special days and new moons were observed within Pharisaic Judaism of that day is not a dispute. Shaul also observed them as Torah commanded by Adonai as an observant Jew. But it is also possible that the perverters, the Judaizers, changed the scriptural and legitimate observance of the Moedim, the festival days, and Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, by adding oral Torah requirements to them and making other additions to Adonai's Torah commands. So those perverters possibly had already convinced the Galatians that to be a part of Israel, to be within the Judaism of that day, that they had to be circumcised, they had to be immersed, they had to follow written Torah, and they had to follow oral Torah. Now, to follow written Torah was not in dispute by But in this verse, it is possible that his meaning was that following oral Torah had caused a legalistic perversion of the Moedim and the other events of written Torah. So which of the two is correct? Were the Galatians observing Torah in the wrong way, or were they following their former pagan practices? We don't know for certain, but whichever it was, either one of them was a departure from the truth which Shaul had taught them. So we may never know any more than that, but the truth is that whatever it was wrong. I fear that for you my labor has been wasted. Shaul feared that the Galatians had abandoned the good news. He had taught them in favor of the gospel of the perverters, or that they had returned to paganism. Brothers, I beg you to become as I am, because I became as you are. These words are a little bit confusing, and just reading the words does not exactly accurately describe what Shaul was saying. Although the word become is directly translated from ginomai in the Greek, which means to come into being, to become, it is what we would call stilted language. Essentially what was going on is that Shaul was urging the Galatians to return to the true way, to be Messianic followers of Yeshua, and to have the same understanding which he himself now had. Because they had now turned to the legalistic perversion of Torah where he was formerly, he urged them to turn to where he was now, and to the true worship of Yeshua. And if you remember reading in Acts, he made a similar statement before King Agrippa. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe. Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time you are trying to persuade me to be Messianic? And Paul said, whether short or long, I would pray to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today would become such as I am, except for these chains. Now I underlined become there because this is what he's referring to. He's wanting them to return to the truth. You have not done me any wrong at all. And Shaul here is saying that even though they had turned away from his teaching, that they had not offended him, for he was forgiving them. You know that it was in the weakness of the flesh. Now the weakness here comes from the Greek word astheneia, which means weakness or frailty. Shaul seems to be saying that he was ill, that he didn't feel well when he first went there. That I first brought the Besharat Hagulah, brought the good news to you. Because of his love for them, even though he was ill, Shaul carried his teaching to its conclusion. So his weakness of the flesh that we hear about may have been the thorn in the flesh, which he spoke about in 2 Corinthians 12. And you did not despise or reject me because of my physical condition. He's saying that the Galatians were gracious in their reception of him, not looking down on him because of his visible sickness. And it probably would have had to have been pretty bad for him to think that about himself, and they graciously overlooked whatever it was that was going on. But receive me as if I had been a malach, an angel, or a messenger of Elohim, even as Yeshua HaMashiach himself. So they graciously received him as as if he were Yeshua. Where then is the joy that you spoke of? They no longer had the joy which they had when Shaul was physically present with them and taught them the good news. For I tell you, truthfully, that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. So the first time he was there, the Galatians received him so well, they were so committed to serving him, they would have complied with anything which he requested. But now they have backed away somehow. They're not as ready to see him. Have I now become your enemy by speaking the truth to you? Now that they were following the perverters, they were no longer friendly to Shaul, who taught them the truth. They, that is the perverters, the teachers of legalistic interpretation of Torah, are zealous toward you, but for no good. They want to cause you to separate from us so that you might be zealous for them. The perverters were trying to make their influence greater than Shaul's in the Galatian congregations, so that the Galatians would become evangelists for the perverters' cause. And it's good to be zealous regarding a good thing, even when I am not present with you. Even though the perverters were zealous toward the Galatians that they would accept their message, Shaul hoped that they, the Galatians, would be zealous even in his absence for the good news which he had preached to them. My children, I travail again for you until Mashiach is formed in your life. Shaul was once against praying, travailing for them, because they had departed from the truth which he had originally presented to them. We have a Greek word here, odino, which is translated travail, and it means to have birth pangs. Shaul used the metaphor here of travailing for birth to show how much he wanted the Galatians to turn away from the perverter's gospel and to rebirth, to reform the truth about Messiah as he had originally presented it to them. Morpho means to form. The Galatians needed to form, to make firm the truth which Shaul had originally preached to them. Even now, I wish that I was present with you and could change my tone of voice. Shaul wished that he could speak directly to the Galatians regarding their falling away. That somehow, through changing his tone of voice, through earnestly entreating them, he could convince them of the truth. And he was puzzled by their susceptibility, how easily they succumbed to the teaching of the perverters. Tell me, you who wish to be legalistically bound to the Torah. In several of the Bible versions, you will find legalistically bound to the law, rendered as under the law. And this is from the Greek words hyponomon, under the law. Here it continues to mean what we've said about it in the past, legalistic perversion of the law. Don't you hear what the Torah itself says? So Shaul is saying, you who wish to be under the law, are you not listening to? Are you not understanding what the Torah says about trying to keep the Torah to obtain righteousness? And that's been the whole point. That's what the perverters were attempting to get them to do. Now we come to the one that most often gets misunderstood. So I hope that this makes it a little clearer. For it has been written that Abraham Avinu had 2 sons, one by a bondmaiden, that is a slave girl, and the other by the free woman, that is Sarah his wife. And the son, Ishmael, of the bondmaiden, Hagar, a slave, was born through flesh. Ishmael was born because of a desire of Sarah's flesh to have children in the way that she chose, and not through trusting Adonai. Sarah asked Abram to give her a child through Hagar. Genesis 16, 1 and 2. You can look that up. But the son, here we're talking about Isaac, of the free woman, Sarah, Abram's wife, was born through promise. And the promise was Adonai's promise. Then he said, I will surely return to you in about a year's time. Surprisingly, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. So as a child of the promise, a child of the covenant, Isaac was son, Isaac was an heir, and Isaac was not a slave. This is given allegorically. Now here's where the fun starts. An allegory is a literary device used to make a desired point. There are 2 levels of meaning. We have the surface level, which is the actual meaning of the words, and we have the symbolic level, which is the hidden, deeper meaning. These are 2 beritot, 2 covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai, and that symbolizes the legalistic perversion of Torah and brings forth slavery. This is Hagar. So we see Hagar representing the covenant made at Sinai, used allegorically to represent human effort, the legalistic misuse of Torah, or a human effort such as Sarah used to get a child through Hagar. It is not a negative reflection on the actual covenant at Sinai. This is just the upper level of the allegory. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. That's an interesting thing there. We've mentioned this before. Where was Mount Sinai normally portrayed?
In the peninsula, the Sinai Peninsula.
In the Sinai Peninsula. Where did Shaul say it was?
Arabia.
He said it was in Arabia, which is across the Red Sea. But that's a rabbit trail. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and this is representing the legalistic perversion of Torah, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, that is the earthly, physical Jerusalem, is also allegorical, and it relates to human effort. She, Hagar, the legalistic perversion of Torah, as well as her children, that is, all who follow a legalistic perversion of Torah, are in bondage. So what does that mean? Anyone in bondage is a slave. Symbolic Mount Sinai and symbolic physical Jerusalem go hand in hand. Both are physical efforts to establish a relationship with Adonai. Mount Sinai represents the legalistic perversion of the Torah, and physical Jerusalem is a parallel portrayal of the same thing. But both of them are on the surface level of our allegory. That's important. But Jerusalem above, heavenly Jerusalem, spiritual Jerusalem, is free. That is not a slave. She is our mother. And heavenly Jerusalem represents the free woman, Sarah. and symbolizes the promise to those who trust or faith approach God through Messiah Yeshua. So Sarah's children are those who are in proper relationship with Yeshua. We are the free children of the free woman. We are not slaves who are trying to maintain a relationship with God through works. So this is the spiritual level of the allegory, which teaches us that we are not to try and keep Torah in order to obtain righteousness. The only way is through trusting faith in Yeshua as Messiah. For it has been written, Rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who do not have birth pains. For the deserted one has many more children than she who has a husband. In Isaiah, Adonai was promising Israel a return from Babylonian captivity and the repopulation of her cities. Using this in Shaul's allegory, the barren are those who wait upon and receive the promise, not taking matters into their own hands through the legalistic perversion of Torah. So Isaiah is teaching us through this that we who have waited upon the promise and have not legalistically taken matters into our own hands will bear the most spiritual children. And we, Shaul is talking about himself and his fellow workers. And then he says to the Galatians, Akim, brothers, speaking to the Galatian brothers, are as Yitzchak as Isaac was, children of promise. So what we see is that Shaul is saying that he and his fellow workers, through their correct way of obtaining righteousness, are children of the promise given to Abraham and his seed, Yeshua. But just as he who was born according to the flesh, that is Ishmael, persecuted him born according to the Ruach, Isaac, so it is now also. What we're seeing is just as Ishmael persecuted Isaac by mocking him in Genesis 21:9, the Jews at that time who were legalistically perverting Torah were also persecuting Shaul and his disciples. But what you see is that's also an allegory. But we also see that some of Ishmael's physical descendants are today persecuting Isaac's physical. And that is not an allegory. That's the truth. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the bondmaiden and her son, for the son of the bondmaiden shall by no means be heir with the son of the free woman. And that's Genesis 21:10. The slave woman and her son is again an allegory. It's a representation of human effort to obtain what only Adonai can provide. In other words, legalistic interpretation of the Torah can bring no inheritance from God. It is only through faith in Messiah Yeshua that we become sons and legal heirs. Therefore, Akim, brothers, we are not children of the bondmaiden, but of the free woman. According to Shaul's allegory, those who are bound to Messiah Yeshua through trusting faith and not by slavishly trying to keep the commands of Torah are children of the free woman and heirs to the promise of Adonai. Anyone who attempts to obey the commands of Torah in order to be made righteous, in order to be saved, is the child of the slave woman and not an heir to the promise. And so I have a synopsis, which I'm not going to go through all of it today, but I will go to the last paragraph of it to conclude. What we can see in this chapter, that it has continued to conform to Shaul's basic thesis. No person can be justified before Adonai by obeying any list of rules or teachings. And we who have today, those of us here who have trusted through the way which Shaul taught, understand that salvation through Yeshua is only by Adonai's grace through faith. We also understand that what was then known as oral Torah, which later became the Mishnah, was written down, and then later on incorporated with other writings and became the Talmud. We understand that that is valuable for understanding in some cases, but it is not in any way authoritative for us. It's important that we understand that. Our only authority is Adonai's written Torah, Genesis through Revelation, which Shaul described as inspired by God and useful for teaching, for reproof, for restoration, and for training in righteousness. You all know that one by heart. That's 2 Timothy 3:16. Remembering what Shaul did after he trusted in Yeshua, that is, continued to follow Torah commands, as evidenced by his offering of sacrifices in the temple about 25 years after Yeshua died on the stake, is proof for us that it was not the mitzvot, it was not the commands themselves which ended. Shaul continued to follow Torah even after he trusted in Yeshua. It was the system of sacrifices administered through the Levitical priesthood which ended. And this has convinced us that Adonai's Torah, all of his commands found throughout all of Scripture, have not only not been done away with, but are no longer just written on stone or paper, but also on our hearts once we have trusted in Yeshua. And that's the bottom line.
Amen.
Shabbat Shalom.
And that goes full circle all the way back. I mean, it's where we started out.